All right. Thank you all for joining our Environmental Justice Practitioners Network. We're so grateful to have Gail Forsyth-Vail here as our guest speaker, talking today about an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, our 2020 UUA Common Read. And particularly lucky because Gail recently retired from the UUA in her role. So congratulations and welcome if everyone will say hi to Gail.
Hi, thanks, Allie. I'm really excited to be here. The Common Read and this book in particular are pretty close to my heart. And I am a religious educator, and I just retired as the interim director of Lifespan Faith Engagement, which comprises the youth office, the young adult office, and the faith development office. So I'm trying to figure out what retirement means as I'm entering into week 3 of being a retired person. I am the author of the Indigenous Peoples History Discussion Guide, and the Common Read was my project. I chaired the Common Read Selection Committee for a whole bunch of years. So I can, I'm happy to talk about this and to talk a little bit and answer your questions and talk a little bit about what a Common Read is and about this particular Common Read and what the selection committee, the reasons the selection committee chose this one this year, and to answer your questions as I can. So does that seem about right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Gail, there's also some content in the discussion guide particular to climate justice and environmental justice. So I hope we can get into that a little bit too.
Yeah, we will. That's great, because this group is all brought together by that particular commitment. So I will say that we began a program of a Common Read ahead of the Justice General Assembly in 2012 in Phoenix, and the reason was that it was a task. As a religious educator, I was tasked with helping find materials to prepare congregations to go to Justice GA and to learn quickly about immigration. I have always believed that the lower the threshold, the lower you can make the threshold for people to participate in an educational experience, the better. And it seemed to me that a book group had a pretty low threshold. People know what that is. They know how to participate. They know what to do. So the Common Read began there, and it has pretty much taken off. Many congregations across the association take part in the Common Read. Every year a selection committee looks at some books. Some of them come from, as does this year's selection, come from Beacon Press, which is our public publishing house, if you will. Some of the titles we look at come from Skinner House Books, which is more of the internal publishing house that publishes books that are more intended for Unitarian Universalists. We've looked at both of those kinds of books. We've also looked at things that are not published by UU sources. So one year it was Just Mercy that we named as the Common Read, and Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. So there's a whole list of them, and the discussion guides are still available on the UUA website. This particular year, Beacon Press had 4 or 5 years ago published an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And in the last year and a half, Debbie Reese and Jean Mendoza. Debbie is a children's librarian who is Indigenous, and Jean Mendoza is a curriculum writer. They had been working on a young people's version of Indigenous Peoples history, and by young people meaning high school-ish and college students. So we looked at the new version as a possible Common Read, and it was among other books that we considered, but we always begin our meetings by naming the important things that are circulating in Unitarian Universalism at the moment. And 2 of the ones that seemed really important were the climate justice commitments that congregations were making, and the commitments to supporting Indigenous people in climate justice work, and also the fact that our General Assembly in June will be in Providence, Rhode Island, which is within the traditional territory of the Wampanoag people, who were the people it's going to be the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrim landing at Plymouth, and General Assembly will be within the traditional territory of the Wampanoag people. So that being said, the committee looked at it and said, let's just name the young people's version. It was more accessible to people who are not who don't like academic reading than the original. It had a lot of sidebars and activities, and of course it was 5 years newer than the original version. And we talked a lot and decided that if it was going to be if it was possible for me to write a discussion guide that would work with either version, that we would like to name both of them together. So that's where we eventually came to, is naming both the original Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States and the Young People's adaptation of that book as the Common Reads, and invited people to read whichever one is more accessible to them, whichever one works better for them. So the form that a Common Read discussion guide always takes is that there's a single session discussion for congregations that only want to do a single session, and then there's a 3-session discussion in the discussion guide, and that one, this 3-session discussion, is obviously goes in more depth than the single session. But for me, when I begin to look at how to approach a book, the important thing, it's a discussion guide. It's not a chapter by chapter study guide. And so there's this question of, what are the themes we want to talk about here? And what does this mean for Unitarian Universalists? So those are the big questions when you go into a discussion guide like that. And so, so rather than go chapter by chapter, it really works with themes. And in the 3-part guide, one of the themes is the story, is how the story has been shaped about Indigenous people in this country, and what are the story myths that we hold that uphold a system that that not only excuse genocide, but also continues to talk about Indigenous people as though they were long ago and far away and kind of exotic. So what are the stories, and what's the counter narrative to those stories that's presented in the book? So that was one discussion. The second one was about land. That land is really a key to this story in so many ways, the appropriation of resources. And the third one is about reclamation, because there's a message of, we Indigenous people, and I'm not saying we including me, but the message is, we Indigenous people are still here. Don't pretend, or don't speak as though we are no longer here. And Indigenous people in the United States and Canada and other places around the world are really working hard on reclaiming language and story, and moving forward with their own commitments to community and to environmental justice and to social justice and to sovereignty of their own. So so that's the way that the discussion guide got framed. I will say that the Common Read Selection Committee, which is both racially and ethnically diverse. It's also generationally diverse. There were a couple of young adults as part of the selection committee, looked at the discussion guide, made some comments, and then the discussion guide, we hired a religious educator who is a member of a UU congregation and is also an enrolled member of an Anishinaabe band in Minnesota, to take a look at it. And some differences in emphasis emerged from her comments about the discussion guide, in particular wanting the discussion guide to really tackle the residential school story in a broader, deeper way than it was in the guide. So those are some of the things that happened in the course of the development of the guide. But I'm sort of wondering, I can talk to you a little bit about the climate justice parts of it, or talk about what's the most helpful thing for me to do here?
Sure. Well, from the intro we had, it seems most folks on the call are planning to actually have a discussion at their congregation. So I think any tips you have, Gail, in terms of like how to successfully engage as many people and get that going, and
Mhm.
also how to use this to prepare for General Assembly, like, yeah, both individually and with your congregation. One thing I find really interesting about the guide is that it just goes straight to UU history of colonial action, and that's also a very big theme for us for this General Assembly in 2020. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Gail?
Well, I I think that the project of the colonization of the United States and of Canada also, although Canadian story is a little bit different, it's also a colonization project. Um, that that Unitarians and Universalists, but in particular Unitarians, were really wrapped up in that project. This new country um, was also a country that was built on the taking of land. That one of the things that I really hadn't thought about until I read the book, the original book, a few years back, was some conversation about, for example, about covenant. That our tradition is built on covenant. That we have a historical association with covenant, and yet the writing of covenants necessarily draws boundaries around who's part of the covenant and who is not part of the covenant, and that the original that the people that to which we trace the beginnings of our tradition in this country, the early Puritans who are the forebears of who ultimately became Unitarian, drew covenants which were explicitly not inclusive of the indigenous people in when they arrived here. So the idea that covenant has there's a whole chapter about covenant in the original book and about the problem with covenant. And what Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz says is that the country is a covenantal country, that that our founding documents, if you will, are a sort of national covenant, and that indigenous people have been left out of that covenant from the beginning. So we see Thomas Jefferson, who was a Unitarian, and who, in my early days as a religious educator, we held up with great pride as being a Unitarian person, was one of the architects, a big part of the architects of the policy toward the indigenous people in the new United States. That the original uh, Congress of the United States, about half the legislation that it took up had to do with limiting the rights and taking land, and sort of managing the indigenous people problem. So from the beginning, the country, Washington, felt as though indigenous people were destined to disappear. So from the beginning of the country, the project was to take this land and to kind of force indigenous people into extinction, disappearance. So to know that as the kind of philosophical underbelly, if you will, of the beginning of this country shifts things. So when Dunbar Ortiz is writing her book, she's putting the story of the indigenous people smack in the center of the way the story is told. And in one of the when I was on sabbatical 15 years ago, I was traveling around the Great Lakes and in Canada, and one of the things that I was doing, because I'm a bit of an amateur historian, was I was going to a lot of local museums. You can find out a lot at local museums. Among other things, you can find out what local people think their history is. But what I noted was something that was not familiar to me in New England, at least, and that's that I'd go to these little local museums, the one-room museums, and the story always began at the end of the last ice age. The story always began there when the ice receded. And so as I read Dunbar Ortiz's book, I realized that the story begins when the ice recedes. The story begins with the first peoples here. The story doesn't begin with somebody discovering something. It begins with the people who were here and their story, and the ways in which they managed environment, the ways in which they managed the land, the trade networks, the roads, the whole civilizations that were pushed aside, wiped out, murdered, to make way for this new project here, the new country. So those are some of the things that occur to me as I think about it. The really Jefferson, another piece that occurs to me is the English understanding of personal private ownership of land, and the idea being brought that's what God wanted. So some of the story that came with the settlers was actually biblical. The story of the entry into the promised land, that is biblical. And if you read that story and Joshua and the entry into the promised land, what happens after the Jewish people enter the promised land, the part that that we don't often talk about is that in the biblical story, God basically tells the children of Israel to slaughter everybody, including cattle, everything in Canaan, and go in and take it over. And it is with that understanding and that story that that the settlers from Europe, from England, came to I have to talk a little bit about the story that happened in New England. Is a little bit different than the story that happened in Virginia, but in New England, anyway, that is the story that they were bringing with them. And so the role that the indigenous people here was to play was the role of the Canaanites. And if you look in New England, you'll do a search on Canaan, you'll find towns all over the place named Canaan and New Canaan and all sorts of things. And it's because the indigenous people who are already here were to play a particular role. And it was a role to reenact the biblical story. And when you hear our politicians talk about the city on the hill, and that's politicians, whether they are Democratic or Republican, the first person to bring that city on the hill metaphor into our public discourse was John F. Kennedy. When they talk about the city on the hill, it's American exceptionalism. It's this great American experiment, which was going to come over to build this new thing on this land. And the only problem is there were already people here. So the problem became getting rid of those people here, and the ways in which that has happened. Talked a lot. Do you want to stop and ask anything?
Sure. Yeah, we can open up for some questions. Does anyone have a question for Gail?
Well, I'm still interested in some of the climate aspects of it. And I think the most significant climate aspect is we have switched from essentially a natural environment-based economy to a manufacturing economy that emphasizes growth. And that's, I think, a direct result of the colonial impetus of the settlers from over in Europe.
Things to be used, land to be used, as opposed to land being a part of the system, the human beings being a piece of an ecosystem. So it's a completely different ethic. You're right, that the settlers are bringing an ethic that basically said the land was given to us by God, and we should exploit it however we wish. And I think we are there are great consequences to that, yes. And that
there is a term in economics, the alienation of land or the alienation of property, which I think captures it pretty well. We get alienated from where we are or what our natural resources are.
This is not in the book, but as a religious educator, one of the things that I found fascinating was looking at the ways in which culturally, and I took a course that was for Canadian teachers about how to be inclusive of Indigenous people in your classroom, Indigenous children. And one of the things they were saying is that, from the word go, from the first picture books, right? White children are taught to classify. We classify. These are the farm animals, these are the zoo animals, these are the butterflies, these are the, all the things. And an Indigenous child learns things by environment. These are the things that live in the pond, and these are the things that live in the in the prairie and things like that, so that it's a completely different way of, even from the very beginning, from childhood, of understanding relationship to the natural world. And that had implications. White Canadian teachers actually needed to kind of really begin to understand that in order to effectively teach children who were Indigenous. And so that was an eye-opener to me. So you're right, Bill, and it comes from a very early age that we do that human beings are kind of at the top of the pyramid, and everything else is something to be classified and exploited and used however we wish. So there's a question in the question box which says, some years ago, the UUA board and some congregations, mine included, repudiated the doctrine of discovery. What impact has that had beyond an increased awareness among those who participated? I can explain the doctrine of discovery a bit. There are a bunch of pages on UUA.org about the doctrine of discovery and about the process of repudiating that, if you're interested in that. The doctrine of discovery was the theological, philosophical, ethical basis for the conquering of the Americas. It had its roots really in the Crusades, in the sense that in the Crusades, Europeans developed a philosophy that they could go take land from infidels, people who were not Christian. And the doctrine of discovery, basically, it was a papal bull originally that allowed, and it divided the Americas between Spain and Portugal, which is why Brazil is Portuguese speaking. But the idea was that that these lands were free they were called terra nullis. They were empty land because there were not Christians living there. That was the philosophical basis for all of those voyages of discovery, also for slavery, lots of different things. Eventually the English and the Dutch and others got in on the game, and they also affirmed the doctrine of discovery. And the new United States, one of the first major rulings out of the US Supreme Court in 1823 was an affirmation of the doctrine of discovery. So although we overthrew the king, the US government claimed to itself the rights over the Indigenous people that the King of England had held. And so that was what the doctrine of discovery, and among other things, what that said. Ultimately, through a bunch of court cases, Indigenous people became called domestic dependent nations, which gave the US government a lot of rights, which is by law, not morally, but by law, a lot of legal rights. And right now, many Indigenous people want to raise awareness of the doctrine of discovery and the long, long, long effect it's had. It's the basis of all of our real estate law in this country. It's the basis of international law. There's a lot of work on trying to get the doctrine of discovery repudiated, which is partly symbolic, but it's partly, how do we root this thing out that's 500 years old, that has caused so much damage over so many years, which is why sovereignty, self-determination is such an important thing for Indigenous nations, because their sovereignty was taken away by the doctrine of discovery and by the court cases that emerged from it in the United States. What impact has that had among those who participated? I'd like to think that those who are, it's hard for me to know from having, from being sort of in the faith development office at the center of things at the UUA. I know we've done a lot of material about the doctrine of discovery, and I know we get a lot of queries about materials about the doctrine of discovery. I know that there are other religious groups that have done a study of the doctrine of discovery, that we're not the only religious group that repudiated it. That, as a matter of fact, you can find on UUA, there's links to all of the educational materials from various other denominations about that. I like to think it allows us to enter into interfaith efforts, and that it allows us, by being aware of what, of this monstrous idea, that we have a place to begin in terms of bringing some humility to relationships with Indigenous people. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I see it as. It's kind of like doing your homework, and knowing that there's a lot of work to be done, and knowing that some of that work is legal. There's a lot of legal work being done. There's work being done through the United Nations. One of the important things is that in 2010, the United Nations passed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It took the election of Barack Obama to get the US to sign on. The US was one of 2 nations that refused to sign that document. It's an aspirational document as much as anything, but there is a UN special rapporteur who tries to work with governments around Indigenous people's rights. But one of the things that's really important about that particular piece of legislation is that after the Second World War, the UN began to pay attention to human rights. Before that, the UN was sort of nation-to-nation things. And that was individual human rights. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was the first time in which Indigenous peoples were granted rights under international law. And those rights, which had been taken away from, as I said, doctrine of discovery was really the beginning of international law. And so this was a dramatic shift in legal understanding to have there be rights for a people under international law. So that's the best answer I have to that question.
If I could share a couple pieces of information. Some folks might know this, but at Standing Rock, they called faith leaders across the country to come, and they, like 300 or so faith leaders together, including many UUs, put it in the fire, literally, symbolically, burned the doctrine of discovery together at Standing Rock to create a physical community manifestation of repudiating it. I think Gail, it's so true that it's both a spiritual, cultural, and ideological shift for us, right? To repudiate it actually involves shifting your perspective about the United States and about relationship to land and relationship to country and Indigenous peoples. But also we see, so there's a coalition UUs are a part of called the International Initiative for Transformative Collaboration. This is one of the ways, part of my goal with this webinar was to provide ways that we can use the Common Read as part of greater learning in the faith community to deepen our work towards environmental justice and climate justice in partnership and solidarity with Indigenous peoples. And so INITC is short for International Initiative for Transformative Collaboration. And some of the Native folks involved in that project are youth who are Native, who went over to the Pope and visited with the Pope and his high representatives in Rome asking them to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. And one of the main legal scholars, Stephen Newcomb, is also planning to come to the next INITC gathering. So we are not just, I think it was one thing, 8 years ago to repudiate it. And we have been working to literally build these relationships, deepen our connections. And that work it continues. So I wanted to offer that.
Thanks, Sally. So it kind of is twofold. It's about uncovering the story and acknowledging that, and having the humility to know that that our faith tradition was complicit. That one of the justices that made the doctrine of discovery ruling in 1823 was a Unitarian. To know that, and that helps in the present day. The ability to come in with humility to those partnerships, and to understand that that the leadership needs to come from Indigenous people if it's about Indigenous people's issues, and that sometimes those issues look different. In Maine, it's really, really, really about the water and the fishing. It's about that. In some places, it's about mining. That's the most important. In other places, it's about language. In some places, it's about reclaiming lost history. It's so different. Indigenous groups have different high priorities. I know in Massachusetts, one of the priorities of the United Indigenous Peoples Group is to get legislation through the state to name Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day. So there are different things that the Indigenous people in each area have that are important, that are their strategic priorities, and it helps white people who want to support those strategic priorities to remember that that we don't have the answers, and that we were raised on a story which devalues and destroys Indigenous people, and pretends that they are not still here. So those, it's part of this is just understanding the place that we're coming from, and the education that we have to do, the things we have to unlearn. I think one of the things that was important in even in writing the discussion guide was to also realize that there are Indigenous people who are also Unitarian Universalists, and to know that, and some of them are Indigenous people who are tribally enrolled, and some of them are Indigenous people who are not tribally enrolled because their tribal structure was destroyed at some point along the way in some of the terrible things that have been done. So, but to know that you don't want to be, for example, in a room of people where everybody talks about Halloween costumes and all of the ways in which Indigenous people have been devalued, or talk about the land, or talk, those things in a way that can re-traumatize Indigenous people that might be in the room. So being really careful about what stories we put out in the room, what stories people choose to share. And I'll tell you a little story about something that I learned. I went to the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery conference about, a year after General Assembly, and I was invited to be part of the planning team. It was largely Indigenous people at this conference in Phoenix, and I was asked I'm a storyteller. I was asked to tell the story of Canaan and the entry into Canaan, and what that had to do with, and I told the story jointly with an Indigenous person, but what that had to do with the story of the United States. There were people in the room who were really upset that story was even kind of put into the room. Even in the spirit of saying this story is a problem, that the story was even put into the room was a problem for people. So part of the conversations that need to happen as you do the discussion guide and as you begin to work to kind of look at what the environmental priorities are of the Indigenous people in your area and how congregation might support that, is to remember that there are conversations that need to happen, like with white people, to kind of name, particularly white people, but to name our stuff, the Halloween costumes and the cartoons and all of those things that allowed, as a white person, allowed me to unconsciously take in the whole American story about the whole terminal narrative about Indigenous people. And there's work to be done there, but it can't be done. It shouldn't be done in a room where Indigenous people are. So that was one of the learnings that I had, and one of the things that's kind of written into the discussion guide as well. I think let's stop and ask what your questions are, because I know you want to talk about some of the environmental things, the history, the story of Standing Rock is one such story. The story of the partnership with Lummi Nation to stop was a gas terminal. I don't know. Yeah. Was it a coal terminal? So there are stories of that type. In Maine, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission working on having to do with Indigenous kids being taken away from their families by the foster system. And some of the congregations in Maine got involved in supporting ally groups that were supporting that Truth and Reconciliation process about that.
There was a really good video that was on PBS about that, Truth and Reconciliation.
Dawnland, right?
Dawnland, yes.
Yeah.
DAWNLAND. That probably, I watched it just streaming it online. So if people wanted to,
it is
familiar with that.
It's an excellent video. I think Wampanoag people are involved very deeply in the 400th anniversary celebration of the Plymouth landing. Among other things, out of concern that this will become a national celebration of what was a devastating event for Indigenous people here. And I've heard Wampanoag scholars speaking about it, and one of the things that they argue for, as I said, in these little museums in Canada, they began the story like 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. Wampanoag scholars are arguing for beginning the story of the colonists not in 1620 at Plymouth Rock, but in 1614, when the first people came and kidnapped and enslaved Indigenous people and brought them back to England and spread diseases and so on and so forth. But by changing the beginning of the story back to 1614, it shifts the entire story. So it opens up some ways of re-examining our relationship to country and to land and to environment. When you see, I live in the Merrimack Valley in Massachusetts, the Merrimack River Valley, and it's a series of small industrial cities and towns all along the river. But the people that preceded the English settlers, the river was one. The Merrimack River Valley was one, not a series of have and have not municipalities along the banks. So those things can teach us a lot of things.
Gail, can you say more about the section about Standing Rock in the new book? For folks who are preparing to study, just FYI, it's page 33 and 34 of the study guide that have the 20-minute section on climate justice, kind of towards the end of the third session. But that's based on the youth chapter or the youth book, and new content in that. Would you speak a little more about that, Gail?
Sure. I will say that when we first started writing this, that climate justice was earlier in the discussion guide, and then it became, it shifted around because of the need to really focus a bunch on the residential school issues. But Standing Rock was a I think in many ways a defining moment for Indigenous young people, and it also seemed to bring to the attention of Unitarian Universalists Indigenous issues and environmental issues in a way that hadn't happened before. When we went to Phoenix, and the Indigenous people in Phoenix were saying, okay, immigrant justice and Indigenous rights are not two separate things, they're the same thing. I'm not sure that we, as a Unitarian Universalist movement, understood that in that moment, but I think we're understanding some things now that we didn't then. So what the discussion guide looks at is it asks people to talk about their experiences in climate justice rallies and events where Indigenous leaders are part of the leadership team. I think when I went to the climate justice strikes in Boston in the fall, there were Indigenous young people who spoke, and the ways in which they framed their speaking was different from the ways in which some of the white people who spoke framed their speaking. So it's asking people to talk about that, to talk about how their congregation responded and what they're learning from listening to speakers who are Indigenous at climate justice events. It's also, there's a question that says, how does the respect for the treaty rights and the sovereignty of Indigenous people present an alternative to an extractive economy and the damage it does? So it's asking people to find out about their own area. I don't think you can do work with Indigenous peoples or climate issues. I think both of those things are really local. I mean, I know that there are national things like the Clean Air Act and things like that, but in general, both Indigenous rights and climate justice work are intensely local. You need to find out what's going on in your area. And so the discussion guide asks people to look at that and to find out how you learn about the priorities that are important to the Indigenous people in your area.
Well, they are international as well, and there are Indigenous issues in the international scene.
Right, and those are a lot of those are legal, and those are really important. But there's also, when it comes right down to protecting a waterway, or making sure that that a gas line doesn't get built or something like that, those are intensely local manifestations of, yes, a global issue, but it has different ways that it looks locally. And the Indigenous peoples in your area will be approaching it differently too.
But on the other hand, I agree with that. But on the other hand, like, some of these issues are rural based on, the location of like tribal nations and things. And in those cases, they need people from other places to support what they're doing, like their leadership. So I think it's important that we don't just look for what might be happening close to us, but also be on the lookout for opportunities to support people, even if they're far away, because often those are still, the oil that's being taken out of the ground that benefits us, even if we're far away and we're hurting, and that's hurting, people far away, but there's still something that we can do to support them in their effort. You know what I mean?
And we work on a statewide basis as well. For example, you mentioned the Lummi tribe in Bellingham and stopping the coal terminal there. That was a statewide effort. And it's also applied to other parts of Washington state where we've stopped oil terminals and gas terminals. And it's only possible to do that by mobilizing the whole state. And of course, a lot of allied groups as well. We're not doing it alone as UUs.
But it helps. Mobilization works better if people are already in relationship with other faith groups, with Indigenous people, with groups that are working on it. So yes, absolutely. But there need to be grassroots partnership building things so that when it's time to call everybody out for something, there are already partnerships and there are already relationships that can be called upon, that you can mobilize from. And I think what the discussion guide asks is for congregations to just begin to think about that, learn about what's in your area. Who are the Indigenous people in your area? Do you know who they are? Do you know what the story is? I know that after the repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery at General Assembly, the UUA received some money from a Unitarian Universalist, and he had been at General Assembly, and his parents had died, and he and his siblings had inherited a small amount of money from the sale of their parents' land in, I believe it was in Kansas. Anyway, he felt as though he needed to do something to that land had been taken from Indigenous people ultimately, and that his forebears had settled that land that had been stolen, and so he wanting to do something in by way of reparations. He gave some money to the UUA to help produce some materials having to do with learning about the Doctrine of Discovery. So that was a concrete action that this person decided to take, because I think when you start to pay attention locally, you start to realize that the ways the stories are told matter, that the way in which children are taught matters, that that the way in which you speak about, do you live do you live within a municipal boundary, or do you think of yourself as living in a geographical area? Those things it helps you to switch your thinking. I think it makes you more open to hearing things that are really going to challenge. These are identity-based questions. I mean, I will only speak for myself. I grew up with the civic religion. I lived in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And I learned a new patriotic song every year of elementary school until we knew them all. And so for me, over the course of high school, and middle school and high school in the late 60s and early 70s, it was a question of total deconstruction of the story that I had grown up with and having to learn a new one. And I think some of that changes the way in which you enter conversations about environmental justice. It gives you empathy for other people who were taught the same way as you, and it also provides you, I think, a way to begin to help them as well as yourself unpack that stuff. The assumptions that we make about, well, I learned when I was going around the Great Lakes that there are 50,000 speakers of Ojibwe between the US and Canada, and that you can major in Ojibwe. At that time, it was 4 different universities between the US and Canada. That was like a remarkable revelation to me. It was just remarkable. I did not know this. And it shifts the way you think about the land. It shifts the way you think about the stories. It shifts the way that you understand yourself in relationship to your country and to the land, to begin to be open to knowing those things. And I think as people who are environmental justice activists, I think that local piece is important. It's about finding out who you are and where the land upon which you live, to whom did it once belong, and are the descendants of those people anywhere nearby, and what is the way they might describe where you live, and what are the stories we want to tell our kids. I think all of those things do matter. This is long-term work, and that doesn't say don't go out when there's a call. Don't go out to the State House or or to Standing Rock. It doesn't say that at all. It just says that in order to change yourself and make yourself a better ally, you really need to do that local work too. And I think the congregation needs to find out who its neighbors are and upon whose land it is. It was built. I know that my husband's family hails from Ohio in the Miami River Valley. And I long had a story about them being farmers and settling in there in the 1830s. And that's a story that I accepted. And then all of a sudden, a few years ago, it occurred to me that in order to settle this really excellent farmland in the Miami River Valley in Ohio, somebody else got pushed out. And how did that happen? And what was the legal basis upon which those people got pushed out? And how does that change the way you think about the Miami River Valley, for example? I don't know. So.
Thank you so much, Gail. I'm going to end our recording, and before I do that, I want to just mention that there is a link in the chat, and I'll also put a link in the bottom of the video on YouTube to supplemental resources through the Environmental Justice Practitioners Network or Ministry for Earth and Green Sanctuary. And I just started this today, and I will add to it tomorrow, so it will quickly grow. But that's a live link where you can go to reference some resources for continued deeper diving into this connection of environmental justice and Indigenous land and sovereignty and rights. So thank you, Gail. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.